Good morning, everyone. I will make one little correction. No one gets my name right. It's Annette Maggi, but I never get offended if you pronounce it wrong, so don't ever worry if you talk to me, but just so you know what it actually is. When I was looking at the agenda for this meeting, I thought it was interesting because I got sandwiched in between the recipe development, which is a cool, exciting topic, and then the pork conversation on consumer insights around dinner. And I get the heavy topic, right? But I think that this conversation is actually really important, and I hope will be compelling to you as we move through this topic this morning. So as always, just a list as a consultant, I think it's important to share kind of my conflicts and just clients that I currently have, just so you know. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer those. So 3 things we're going to try and cover today. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the professional code of ethics. The great thing about this session is it counts for your 1 hour of ethics on your continuing ed and your 5-year cycle, so that's a good thing. I think more importantly, we're going to talk about how do we communicate given the current landscape of what's happening in our environment today, and how do we manage that against our code of ethics. And then understand kind of where the biases are and how we really need to manage and communicate appropriately within the code and kind of given what's happening today. So let's kick it off and get started. Many of us are familiar with the idea of what we would consider, and I'll say, a traditional approach to health and wellness, right? So, you know, we talk about fiber, we talk about American Heart Association guidelines. This was just talked about by the previous speaker, you know, the Mediterranean DASH diet. That's what I'll call what we have historically considered a traditional approach to health and wellness. But the reality is, when we think about today's consumer, this is really how they eat, right? So maybe a Monday morning after a rough weekend or a food coma weekend, they're detoxing in some way, shape, or form at breakfast. Lunch, the work crew might be going out for vegetarian or vegan, so they're all in just because they want to go out with their coworkers. But by dinner, they're paleo and they want some big piece of meat. In Iowa, I love to talk about meat. I get to talk about meat in Iowa. But you know, this is really kind of the schizophrenic eating behavior that we have in clients you're seeing and in patients you're seeing today around how they eat. I think at the same time, the consumer has really expanded the definition of health and wellness. So we as dietetics professionals have a definition of what we consider to be healthy living and healthy eating habits. But the consumer perception of this topic is equally important. So I've listed a variety here, you know, everything from no antibiotics or hormones in meat to sustainability to plant forward to non-GMO. You know, it really runs the gamut with consumers today. The challenge in this, I think, and I think this is what impacts all of us, is this idea of where is the science? And do many of these factors and these decisions that consumers are making, or the definition that consumers are using today of healthy living or healthy eating habits, doesn't really have a scientific basis. So I tend to think about this as we have science-based kind of nutrition parameters or lifestyle guidance, but then we really have these value-driven factors that consumers consider. So when you look at this list, you know, there's a variety of these that are much more driven against a value. Carbon footprint is about, I care about the earth, right? I care about the world. That's a value for me. It doesn't necessarily impact public health or my personal health, but it's a value-driven equation. But it matters to me in how I make my food choices. I'm not saying me personally, I'm metaphorically saying the consumer. But, you know, it matters to that consumer in how they make their food choices, what they're buying at the grocery store, what they're preparing. And so I think that we have to now today, as dietitians, really be cognizant of all these factors and consider how do we communicate all of this. But the challenge is that lack of science. And I think the challenge is, can you really define benefits to it? So I think as health influencers, we're all in a quandary of we're trying to help people live healthier lives, but within their value-driven decision-making and within our professional code of ethics. And so I think this is where it all comes together and what we're going to talk about in a little bit of detail today and by walking through some case study examples. I am not an expert in the code of ethics. I did not help write it. I have reviewed it in roles I've had in the House of Delegates, but I think it's important, kind of given the current landscape of consumer decision-making, to go back to this I also think it's more challenging given the environment of communication, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. There are 19 principles of the Code of Ethics. We are going to narrow this down today and talk about specific ones that I think are really germane to the work that many of us do, and the challenges we see today in communication. So we're going to talk a little bit about evidence-based practice and how you really ensure that the approach to the work that you do and I do is evidence-based, and that we're looking at where there is science-based information. One of the challenges I think we have today, not only in consumers, but even among our colleagues, is cherry-picking research, right? And that's a real challenge because there is such a bevy of data out there today, but you have to look at the totality of the research, and you can't just say, I'm going to pick this one study, or this one study puts into question all other research that's been done. You have to be really careful about cherry-picking research. And then we're going to talk a little bit about personal bias and some examples around personal bias, because I think that's an important one, especially, and I'm going to talk a little bit about organic, but I think the landscape on organic is really interesting around health professionals and their practices in some regards around that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how do you know, again, always go to where that consumer is. So setting aside kind of how you choose to eat and how you choose to make decisions at the grocery store, but really to focus on that consumer and that patient or client and what their needs are. I want to talk a little bit before we jump into some case studies, though, about the challenges in communications. And I think especially for younger generations of dietitians who have grown up with Twitter and Snapchat and WhatsApp and all of these different social media tools, this communication challenge is even greater. We have become a society where the number of likes matters, the number of retweets matters more than the actual content being presented. And so in any kind of influencer work, there's this whole question of how many likes are out there. But it's also how many followers do you have? Who's paying attention to your work? And I think that's really difficult because you want to make sure that the content is really the focus and that the content is driven against science-based principles and aligns with ethics, but yet we have this environment around metrics and how that validates what you're doing. It's easier for someone like me because I didn't grow up, given my age, in this environment, but if you're straight out of college, like this matters a lot as a young dietitian. And so there's pieces of that I think are really difficult. I also think there's this idea now, given the use of digital and social, that everybody has a megaphone, right? Everybody has a voice, and there's so much noise out there. I was thinking this week, and I have several emails in my inbox of the Eat Lancet report came out how many months ago, right? But yet all of a sudden it's blipping again, and it's like you got to pay attention to this again, and it's like, what is going on? I haven't taken the time or had the time to really read the emails, but you really have to be paying attention to some of that noise and understanding what's the chatter out there among consumers, but then what's the chatter amongst professionals, and then where is the real science? And then I do think this point about public perception becomes reality. How many of you remember pink slime? When pink slime? Yes. So that was like one consumer who started pink slime. And it went viral, and it became chaos, right? And so it's this power that public perception becomes the reality. There were a lot of unintended consequences of that, and I think if you look at the data of pink slime today, the reality is, and I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it was like millions more animals had to be raised then to compensate and to fill in for that amount of beef that was no longer viable and used in the industry because of that whole consumer incident. But no one hears that story, right? Because that's the practical, logical story. But the consumer perception of what pink slime was what became the story. And so we really have to be cognizant of this fact that public perception does become reality. So what I'm going to do now is walk us through 5 case study examples, and I am happy to take questions and discussion during this because we have time and we're not too overwhelming of a size. So I don't mind if you disagree with me or you throw in questions. So if you have a question, I'm flexible enough you can take them here, okay? So feel free to raise your hand and we'll go through them. So this first one is really around organic and are organic foods more nutritious? And this has been kind of a long-standing issue, I think, in a misperception in consumers' mind. And so this is one for me that really gets to evidence-based practice, right? And also understanding that in-depth knowledge of food. I find it interesting as dietetics professionals, we now have to understand much more about production methodology, farming and ranching than we ever had to before. But you have to have some understanding of organic methodology at the production level to understand why it isn't more nutritious necessarily, but that ties into our ethical standards as dietetics professionals. So if you look at the data that's out there and the science that's out there, there's copious amounts of science that say that organic is not more nutritious, that the pure methodology of organic is not more nutritious. And I would put these examples in front of you. I think what has happened over time is that the organic movement really started in produce, right? And a lot of the research originally was done in produce, and you might see some minor differences in the research around different micronutrients that might be slightly elevated in an individual crop or an individual type of fruit or vegetable. But you cannot extrapolate that data to all fruits and vegetables or all organic product, right? So I would contend, and I don't know anyone would disagree, that organic Oreos are not healthier, they're not a better choice than traditional Oreos, right? But we have representation that would suggest they are, and there is messaging out there that suggests it is. And so I think this is one that we have to be really clear about and really careful about how we message around organic. Organic is a methodology that primarily is really about what I would call that value-driven proposition, and we know that it isn't necessarily healthier from a food experience, so to speak. This is another really interesting example to me about organic and whether or not it's more nutritious. And this is actually one that I came across in a dietitian's blog. So the dietitian had used a headline in the blog that organic milk had 62% higher levels of one of the omega-3 fatty acids. 62% sounds amazing, right? You're like, wow, that's a great hit of a nutrient that all of us need more of. The interesting thing is, if you actually went to the study, you can read the abstract, and the abstract says 62%. It's right there, that's the abstract from the study. But if you actually, and I'm going to back up. So we all know fatty fish, the recommendation from the dietary guidelines is about 250 milligrams a day of omega-3 fatty acids if you pare this down, if you take the nutrients in this serving of fish. So if you looked at the detail of the study, conventional milk has 19.8 milligrams of ALA per half cup serving. Organic milk has 32.1. So the point here, right, is that if you need 250 milligrams a day, the difference between conventional milk and organic milk is 12 milligrams. 12 milligrams. So this is not germanely contributing to the ALA an individual needs. And so yes, it is a 62% increase, but from a scientific basis, 62% of a small number is not that much. And so this is a situation where responsibly and within the code of ethics, this dietitian should have gone to the study itself and read the actual study instead of just reviewing the abstract and said, okay, right, this is not really ethically appropriate to communicate because it isn't 62%, it's 12 milligrams. And so I think this is one where this is a challenge because somebody else is putting this out there, and a dietitian is trying to get out there and be that voice of health and wellness and be the one to share this information and this knowledge with consumers. So you want to do it quickly, you want to respond to things that are in the press or that are blipping in social media, but you still have to do the due diligence to say, is the science there, right? and to say, is this really an appropriate message to be giving to consumers? And I think sometimes this is the challenge. And so I think we have to be really careful. But the problem is, right, these messages get out there and this leads consumer to believe that organic is more nutritious or healthier at some level. And so I think it's a challenge from a communication standpoint that we all have to be aware of. My second example is around pesticides communication, and I think this is one that dietitians are having more and more questions about as we look at agriculture production, and I think consumers, I feel like bioengineering or GML, as consumers call it, is kind of left off on a discussion standpoint, but we're starting to see the emergence of questions around pesticide usage. So when we look at the dietetics practitioner and our code of ethics, this is again about using evidence-based practice and demonstrating that knowledge of food and making decisions and communication points evidence-based. I think the challenge on this particular topic at some regards is it's complicated, right? Pesticides is complicated information. But I think there are some core basic facts that we as professionals can always go back to. One of them being that all pesticides are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. When a consumer asks questions about pesticides, what do you think is their real concern? What are they really asking? Anyone? Yes. So do they harm them? Other thoughts? Yes.
Is the food safe for me to eat?
Yes. Yes. I think that's the crux of it. A consumer who asks a question about pesticides is saying, I want to make sure that this food is safe for me to eat, for those in my household to eat. So sometimes you have to go back to that, what I'll call emotional play of what is the consumer really asking. They're not really asking about pesticides, they're asking about safety. And so to be able to say that there are agencies within our country that are paying attention to this and that regulate pesticides, sometimes that's enough of the story, right? That you don't have to go into in-depth information about it, that you can assure them that there are processes in place to ensure the safety of our food supply. I often say to people, the United States has the safest food supply in the world. And that is true. And that sometimes is enough to make people feel really good about the purchases they're making. Another thing on pesticides, and I do not know why this myth continues, but there continues to be the myth that organic production does not use pesticides. And this is inaccurate. And there are many dietitians who say this, and it's organic production doesn't use synthetic pesticides. And there are examples of pesticides that are used in organic, conventional, and bioengineered crop production that is the same exact pesticide because it's a natural pesticide, but it's used in all types of production. But I think this is one, again, where we have to stop perpetuating the myth and really ensure that consumers understand that organic does use pesticides, it's just not chemical ones. And then we're going to talk about an example, but I think this understanding and trying to get consumers to understand that presence is not an indication of risk. So there may be pesticides residues in food, that doesn't mean it's harmful or risk. You know, we take a risk every day when we drive a car, right? But we don't often think about that, or a consumer doesn't think about that. So I think sometimes giving consumers analogies in their own life can be really helpful in helping them to understand this. So as it relates to pesticides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the dreaded dirty dozen and clean 15. And I will tell you, you will notice on Annette's slide that this is the 2015 dirty dozen. This is intentional on my part because I don't really want the EWG to get more hits on their website for the 2018 or 2019 dirty dozen list. I do this intentionally, just so you know it's not that I haven't updated the slides, I have. But this is a really interesting communication piece to me around the topic of pesticides, because when this comes out every year, there is a media storm about what's on the list, what's added to the list, what's been removed from the list, what does the list look like. If you look at the Environmental Working Group's interpretation of this data, they say that 3/4 of the nearly 7,000 products that have been tested by the USDA contain pesticide residues. So they contain pesticide residues. Does that mean risk? Does that mean harm? And that's the question as ethically bound professionals that you have to ask yourself. It doesn't. If you look at the USDA version of this data, so the USDA is the agency that actually does this testing. So if you go back to the USDA data, what you will find is that 99% of those same 7,000 products that are sampled and tested by the EPA, the residue levels, there were residues above the tolerance levels in less than 1% of products. So what's the message that this dirty dozen sends to consumers, right? It suggests that pesticides are present in these particular fruits and vegetables, and it suggests that they're at harmful levels, which is actually not true. There is are people familiar with the fruit and vegetable? There's a fruit and vegetable, I can't think of the name of it online, but it's where you can go in and you can say, tell me about strawberries. How many servings of strawberries can I eat before I get to a harmful level of pesticide residues? For strawberries, you can eat 180 servings a day. And I don't think we have a problem with consumers eating 180 servings of strawberries a day, right? And so, I mean, I think this is about how you put, like, so when you tell that to a consumer, right, it's ridiculous. So just like you guys laugh, they would laugh too. So again, I think it's about how you communicate this in a responsible way. But I don't think any dietitians should be promoting the dirty dozen list. It isn't something we should be promoting. I think it's actually harmful in the regard that we know fruit and vegetable consumption is the most important things consumers can do to live healthier. Yes.
Okay, so how do I know that those local strawberries that I picked or obtained meet these guidelines? Because there's no inspection that I know of at a local place.
Like you mean at the farmer's markets or?
No, I'm actually going to the farm north of Carroll.
And you're picking your own.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and you don't necessarily, I mean, I think it's the question, and the question I would pose back to you is, and I think here's the challenge in it. A lot of consumers are skeptical of farmers, and they have this concept of farming as a big business and farming as, you know, corporations. In reality, the vast majority of farms are owned by individuals and by family. It might be third generation or fourth generation, those kinds of things. They simply incorporate or put a business entity around their farm for tax purposes and to protect themselves and things like that. It's the same thing I do with my consulting business. So I think you have to believe if you're going to that local farm that that farmer cares about the land, that it's their most valuable asset is the land, that they want to protect the land. They want you as a repeat customer. They want you to come back next year. And so they're going to do everything they can to give you a quality product that meets regulations and that is bound. The other thing about pesticides, and this might partially answer your question as well, is that farmers have to go through training. Not just anyone can A, go buy pesticides or B, apply them. So it's tracked, if you're a farmer, it's tracked what amount of pesticides you're buying, the type you're buying, all of that is regulated. You also have to be trained to apply pesticides to any kind of production field. So there are all kinds of measures in place to make it, to manage that and to make sure it's safe, if that makes sense. Yes?
And I would suggest that she asks the farmer that she buys them from, and that also starts a conversation with that farmer about that that's important to her.
Yes, agreed. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious if you have a follow-up answer in your back pocket when you try all of the great suggestions you just made. You know, it's proven to be safe. You can eat an outrageous serving size before you reach the amount of pesticide level that's not safe, and when that customer still says, yeah, I don't believe that. Do you have a follow-up or a technique that you use to try to share that information with them?
I don't know if there is an answer.
I would suggest you ask if you feed that to your own family.
Right, yeah, and
they're willing to feed it to their family.
Yeah. And that's fair, except in the example of raw milk, which we, let's not go there. But to your point, I mean, I think there's sometimes consumers, consumers will get dug in about what they believe because they don't ever want to be proven wrong, right? And so to suggest that they're wrong, and so I think it's looking at, are they doing anything harmful, or are they doing something that's detrimental maybe versus trying to move them too far. There comes a point where you're just not going to change their mind. And I think that's okay to say that. Like, I feel like, you have an opinion and I'm not going to be able to change that. I think there's part of that. And I think that relates to this slide. And I want to talk a little bit about this because I think this is an important piece about the Dirty Dozen and the implications of it. We all know as health professionals that the dietary importance of consuming fruits and vegetables far outweigh whether it's organic or whether it's conventional or whether it's biotech, as well as kind of this whole concern about pesticide residues. But the interesting thing is there is now a small study out, and it's a small study, but it shows that low-income parents are not buying produce because they can't afford organic produce. And there's so much like mom pressure to be a good mom, you have to buy organic. And I think that is really concerning. And to all of us as dietetics professionals, and again within our code of ethics, we should be concerned about that kind of event happening, and the idea that there's a research out that preliminarily shows that. Because that is concerning. I find it interesting too, there are 2 retail chains in the country that are actually only selling organic produce. And one of them is Natural Grocers, which is based out of Denver. They have about 140 stores kind of from Denver to the river, to the Mississippi River. And then Rayleigh's in California, it has started a new banner of stores where they only sell organic produce. So I would disagree with that idea if it's the idea that this is who your consumer is and they believe this, but I think you have to be really careful about trying to say that that's better or healthier or is going to be beneficial to public health or those kinds of things. And I think that's where, from a code of ethics, we have to be able to differentiate between what is a lifestyle choice or just a choice because you believe in the original philosophies of organic and production versus, really saying that there's a residue difference in pesticides between the two because that hasn't been shown to be true. Yes?
So I work at a retail store, and
Who do you work for?
Hy-Vee.
Oh, hello.
So we get this a lot, and I give a lot of these similar answers. And usually, it doesn't happen all the time, but usually it's also followed up with, well, what do you do? And so then I'm torn between, because I believe I have my own way of eating and raising my family, and I feel like that I do pretty good at separating that from the professional side and trying to stick with the code of ethics. But then what do you do? Because you want to also be human to your consumers, but I don't also want to necessarily sway because I feel like our food choices have lots of different factors, finances, whatever it might be, the media, whatever it might be. So is it ethically okay to respond to them, to tell them what we do, or do we just continue to stick by the book?
And here's what I would say to that. I think it depends. And I think this is about using the communication technique of pivoting. Because sometimes, and I do a lot of work with retail dietitians, and sometimes I know, and I'll come back to answer your exact question, but it's also a similar situation to if you're not a parent and you're dealing with a patient or client or consumer who is a parent, and you're trying to talk to them about how do you feed kids, and they'll say, well, you're not a parent. But the answer to that is to say, I talk to parents every single day in my job, and I work with a lot of parents. You know what I'm saying? So it's about pivoting. So I think in the situation when that consumer says to you, and I think this happens a lot to all dietitians, especially retail dietitians, because you're having the dialogue a lot of times in the grocery store, it's to find that pivot. It's to say, it's to pivot it back to say, I talk to a lot of consumers every day who are thinking about this, or this. Or it's to pivot back to say, today I really want to focus on you. And how can I help you live a healthier life? So it's to pivot it. Because at the end of the day, from a code of ethics standpoint, it is really to say, how do you meet the consumer where they're at? And so it's to say, it doesn't really matter about you, it matters about them. And I think this is challenging in today's environment. You know, I often talk about Justin Bieber. And people know how Justin Bieber was discovered. So Justin Bieber put videos on YouTube and Usher discovered him. And so this idea of younger generations of, I can be a superstar, I can be a rock star, but what it does is it blurs the lines between who I am as an individual and who I am as a professional, because there's this idea that you can do these things and suddenly someone will notice and make you a rock star, you know? And so I think it is challenging from a communication standpoint to separate kind of what you do as a personal individual and what you do as a professional, especially given what we all do. And I have an example, we're going to talk about that. Okay. Any other questions on this, or, yeah, go ahead.
One of your first points you talked about was reflecting back to the EPA regulates pesticides. And in the bigger picture, I mean, I hear so much, whether we're talking EPA or USDA or FDA, there's just so much distrust if it's big government.
Yeah.
How can you counter any of that?
You know what's interesting, and I'm so glad you asked this question, because I had a similar question about 2 weeks ago in a presentation, because my answer used to be that, yes, there are appointed officials who oversee all of our government entities, right? But that there are hundreds of scientists, PhD scientists, and things who are working within all of these agencies, and that they value their job and they believe in integrity in their job, just like all of you believe in integrity in your job. But the question that was put back to me was, given the current political environment, do I still believe that to be true? And that is a challenge, and I don't have the answer to that, given the current political climate. I mean, I think that's a challenge we all face. I think we still have to believe that there is good work being done by the people who show up at 8 o'clock every day at USDA and FDA and EPA, honestly. Yes?
I just want to piggyback about the cost aspect for people that are on limited incomes. There's a lot of products out, cloths to wipe your produce off, or special liquids to spray or soap. And if you comment on how do you address that, because I think that's a barrier too. If people perceive that their food is unsafe unless they use those products rather than just a typical wash, rinse, whatever.
Yeah, and I think it is exactly what you said, of it's to say there's really a simpler answer, and it is just common washing that can work. Yeah, I don't have a lot of background in those products, so I don't really know if there's a difference out of it. Yes.
I'm going to go here because I don't think my voice is going that way. I've been, look at just before.
So, I've talked to a couple people about this. I have 2 daughters, little kids, and the whole oats thing with Cheerios. So when I was at Quincy, I went and talked, yes, glyphosate. And what I didn't know they did an extra spraying right before harvesting to kill the plant so that they could get a more uniform harvest. So that was really my daughters saying, what's up with this? And I'm not going to do Cheerios anymore. And my grandkids were coming over, Grandma, can I have Cheerios? And they were like missing your Cheerios really badly. So I went to the communications officer at the General Mills exhibit, and I also talked to the farming group that, bought out Pioneer and so forth up from Canada. And they admitted it. They said, it's not necessarily every oat farmer does that, but it does help the harvest. But intuitively, and my daughters all have master's degrees and they're well educated, I think one of the things that we can't do is be dismissive. And so by sometimes giving those pat answers, EPA's on it, don't worry about it, not happening. To them, intuitively, killing off plants right before you harvest them with extra pesticide, not something they want to feed their babies. So I just think your example though was much better, I thought, in kind of saying, so I said to him, he's like, well, there's only 1/60th of what FDA allows. So I came home and I said, Julie, it's 1/60th. It's up to you whether you want to fight the battle. And so she came back and she goes, okay, I bought them again, but it's on you if anything happens. But I just think we have to dig deeper. We have to know what those harvesting practices are and not be completely dismissive, because especially with the microbiome stuff, that's going so fast that to always flip back to some, pat answer, I don't think it's gonna work anymore.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point about understanding the consumer who's asking the question, right? And so your daughters are highly educated and, in that throes of young children. And so there is a different answer. And I agree with you that we can't be dismissive. I think it's about knowing that consumer. You probably have daughters because they've been raised by you too, who are more science-minded. And I would often contend today that as consumers want to know about agriculture methodology and agriculture production and all of this, they have to be willing to learn more about science, which is fair. But what I think is interesting is 1/60th, right? And so what I would try and do as a communicator is to find other examples in their lives where they're taking 1/60th of a risk. I would bet car driving my exam. I'm going to keep going back to car driving. I don't know why, and I'm oversimplifying that, but I think you've got to find those analogies then. The other thing sometimes too, and I'm not defending Cheerios and I'm not defending glyphosate, but I think sometimes, and I think this has long been a communication point about bioengineered foods, is that those ingredients have been in the food supply since 97. I think there are people in the room who could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 97-ish. So how many millions of servings of that food have been consumed, and we haven't seen outward issues directly linked to that? And so Cheerios is another example where, and I do not know what your Cheerios started as a food or as a brand, but it would be that same kind of thing too, of how many billions probably of servings of Cheerios have been fed to babies, I think it's, sometimes it's about control. What can a parent control? And control is a really important emotional driver. So the question I would ask is, if you don't serve Cheerios, what are you serving? And then are you verifying, and are you as a consumer doing the research to say glyphosate isn't used on the crops that are used in that particular cereal? So Cheerios has been publicly lauded as an issue, but do you know that about every other single brand? And so is the consumer willing to do that research? But I don't disagree with intuition as a parent, and that's important too. So I think it's good discussion. It's not easy by any means. Okay, I'm going to move on to, and this gets a little bit into personal bias, which I think was one of the questions asked in the back. So let's say that you as a dietitian choose to live a vegan lifestyle. And so there might be an example, and I've kind of painted it out here, that say you're a dietitian who's followed a 100% plant-based eating pattern for 15 years. You don't use any animal products, including honey or wear leather or any of those kinds of things. And you're in a private practice job capacity where you're very actively involved in social media. Periodically, you do traditional media segments. And you also have a personal blog kind of that highlights your vegan lifestyle. So as you dig into this, and this is my point about setting personal bias aside and also going to where the consumer is. And again, I love talking about meat in Iowa because you can, which is very different than in California sometimes. But if you look at data on actual meat consumption, and I'm going to show you a variety of slides, and this is actual retail sales data. But percent of total sales, if you look at meat, fish, and poultry, 14% of grocery retail supermarket sales are meat, fish, and poultry. So you go to the next slide and you see, and the graph on your right, your left, sorry, is data from the Food and Health Survey from IFIC, the International Food Information Council. And this shows changes in consumers' eating patterns around plant-based foods versus actual animal protein foods. And what you can see here is that there's some slight shifts in those who are eating more plant-based proteins, but animal proteins have not dropped. So people are adding plant-based proteins, they're not dropping animal proteins. And then the other piece of data here is USDA, what they use as kind of oftentimes just disappearance data of how much meat is sold in the industry and that kind of thing. But you can see across time here that meat consumption not dropping on any of these types of animal foods, but increasing and maintaining steady for sure. So my point is to say, who is the consumer, right? And I think this is a challenge sometimes because plant-based, plant-forward, plant-focused is really buzzing right now. Interestingly enough, the two foods that are driving the plant-based category, 66% of sales today in plant-based are Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. And I think as dietitians, we can all agree that that isn't what we think about as plant-based, right? But if you start to look at this and the actual percentage of consumers that are vegetarian or vegan, it's actually a very low percentage of consumers in our country follow this eating pattern. And if you look at this data too, so 67% of Americans agree that meat is essential to a balanced diet, and that half believe a meal is not complete without meat on the plate. This is also data which I find interesting from the dietary guidelines for Americans, where we often believe that all consumers are getting the protein they need, but if you look at this data for women, and you look at the dietary guidelines data, which talks about food groups, not individual nutrients, it's actually showing that most women in different age categories are low in the consumption of protein foods. And so my point about this is to say that you may choose to live a vegan lifestyle, and I don't disagree with that. There's science to support it, right? That there are health benefits of a vegan diet if done correctly. But that we can't discount where the average consumer is today and where there is supportive data to say that protein foods, and yes, there are vegan sources of protein foods, there are protein needs among varying populations across the country. So this isn't about the science, right? This is about who is your consumer, how do you separate your own personal lifestyle from that of your consumer. And again, I think this is more and more challenging as we see blurring of personal lives with professional lives. I'm a person, I used to be like, okay, LinkedIn is where I do all my professional contacts. Facebook is with my friends and family. LinkedIn is, business. Snapchat, I don't use. But I used to separate social media types by professional and personal. Nobody does that. Right? It's all blurred. So you have professional colleagues who are Facebook friends who are following you on Instagram, who you Snapchat with. And so there's this huge blurring of our personal and professional lives. But I think when it comes to things related to the code of ethics, you have to really be careful about this, making sure that you're making evidence-based decisions, that you're going to where the consumer is and not putting your personal beliefs onto them. So I think for this scenario of where we have this dietitian who is a vegan in her personal life, but practices in a very consumer-facing variety of roles, that it's important to really have this separation, to say, on the job, I'm really focused on that client, that patient, that consumer, and what are their preferences, versus in my personal life and how I live. I might have that blog on living a vegan lifestyle, and that's okay, but it doesn't necessarily impact your job. You could go out and do presentations, right, on living a vegan lifestyle at meetings like this, and that would be completely within the code of ethics and completely appropriate. But it's more about making sure when you're dealing with the consumer and that client and that patient, to make sure you're focused on where are they at and what's their starting point, and how do you help them live a healthier lifestyle within their starting point. Questions on this before I move on? We're good on this one? Okay, good. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about clean label. When I was putting this presentation together, I was feeling a little bit like, are we still talking about clean label? But then I came across yet another list about foods with 5 ingredients or less, which just kind of exhausts me in all honesty. But I think this is one that has been really challenging for health influencers and health professionals. And this is a topic that, in honesty, I think we probably look at it as it's leveled off, and I think it may have leveled off, but it's still pretty high interest. Whole30 as a eating pattern is kind of based off this in a lot of regards, and avoiding any kind of processed foods. I always like to tell people bread is processed, and if you didn't process bread, either A, you'd be making it from scratch, and I'd love to see you taking raw wheat and milling raw wheat in your kitchen. But I also would say if you buy bread with no preservatives, nothing in it, it will last about 2 days on your kitchen counter. And that's not practical reality for most consumers. But I think this is one that is steady. that is still of interest to consumers, and there are consumers who are making decisions based on this. This is a really interesting piece of work. If you haven't seen this study out of the Center for Science and the Public Interest, they actually in 2017 did a really thorough review of this entire issue around clean label and its history. And where we're at today. What's interesting is you often see that trends will start in the restaurant industry or in the food service industry, and then they move to consumer packaged goods. And that's definitely true of this particular topic. And you see at your far left that a lot of it was started in some of the food areas, more so than packaged goods at the beginning, and it's moved quickly. I think the issue on this is that people want to assign benefit to these foods, right? I often use the example of lasagna. So if you make lasagna from scratch at home, right? So you could go and say, I can buy lasagna noodles, which I believe have 5 ingredients or less, most often. So you could buy lasagna noodles. You could buy any kind of meat-based or non-meat-based protein. You can buy cheese, you can buy sauce or make a homemade sauce, right? But if you had to put together an ingredient deck on finished lasagna, it would not look that different than a frozen lasagna in the freezer section of your local grocery store. And that's where this gets hung up for me. There is no germane benefit to the fact that that frozen lasagna was made in a production facility and is in the freezer department of your store compared to the one you make at home, with the exception if the nutrition is different, right? And so that's where I think we struggle as a profession is, how do you talk about clean label but don't assign benefit to it? And this is the challenge. So it's acknowledging that consumers may choose to purchase items with less than 5 ingredients, but there isn't benefit in that. And that's where you have to really walk this fine line. In the regulatory environment, there is a core tenet called truthful and not misleading. So food labels, any kind of food regulation, at its core, even if the FDA or the USDA haven't defined a specific principle about that topic, it goes back to the point of, is it truthful and not misleading? And I think in a lot of ways, this applies to this section of our code of ethics, right? Is it truthful? Is it not misleading? And I would be happy if there's someone in the room who can define for me what you tell consumers, if you have one, is a benefit of clean label. Or have you heard anything that people are saying is a benefit? Okay. It's hard. I mean, that's my only thing. So this is, and this is really interesting to me, and you start to see retailers doing this. There are many entities today, retailers and even some food companies, who are creating their own lists of acceptable versus non-acceptable ingredients on food labels, different from what the regulatory agencies say. So the FDA, the USDA, there's entire processes around what ingredients can be used in food. CBD, for example, because it's a hot topic right now, is currently regulated as a drug. You cannot put drugs in food, so you cannot legally put CBD in food, contrary to all the media hype that you might be hearing today. But that's a big issue. That isn't a little issue. That's a big, huge issue from moving CBD into food. And I'm just using that as an example, but it's the point that this stuff is heavily regulated and heavily looked at. But I think it's interesting, Whole Foods. So let's take Whole Foods, right? Who are the experts at Whole Foods who know ingredients to know whether they're safe for human consumption? Right? There aren't, really. Have they done the research? Have they combed the, all the data that's available? Probably not. So they're basing this list on what they're seeing in the media, what they're hearing from their consumers that matters to them. And so I begin to wonder, this is a first world problem to me, right? Like, we have an abundance of food. So we get to say, I don't want these 5 things in my food, even though they're proven to be safe for human consumption. But I start to worry when retailers and other companies start creating these lists kind of arbitrarily without having the science behind them. And I think if you're a dietitian who works for Whole Foods, I think you have an ethical responsibility to ask questions about this and to say, how are we determining this? How are we basing this? And to be willing to do that, because we don't know that there actually is any kind of scientific basis behind this. As mentioned, I do a lot of work with retail dietitians, and a couple years ago, I ran a focus group with retail dietitians around clean label. And one of the most interesting things that came out of that discussion was the idea of we should be talking about clear labels, not clean labels. And in their mind, what clear labels mean is that we're defining what ingredients are in a product and why they're in there. What's the function that they provide? And so there are certain companies who have actually started to go down this path. So Campbell's is one of them that I'll use just as an example. And if you go out to, they have this website called What's in Our Food, and they will actually show you for any of their products, all of the sub-ingredients in those products, what their function is and what they're doing in that particular food. And so I really like this approach when consumers start asking about clean label and those kinds of things. It's my bread story, you know. Okay, if you're gonna eat this bread in 2 days, I think it's okay that you buy something that doesn't have preservatives in it, but know that you can safely buy a product that has preservatives in it and that you're safe. But I think these kinds of initiatives are really beneficial, and I think this is where we as professionals have to really say, if we're going to talk more about this whole area, we have to be willing to dig deep into this too and to understand what the ingredient functionality is. Okay, my last example is actually one that came up recently from a dietitian colleague of mine, and I think this is challenging across the board for dietitians today, that you have individuals, patients, clients who want to try a particular weight loss approach where there isn't necessarily strong science supporting that. But this is again where the impact of their family, their friends, others who have lost weight on that program encourage them to try it. So this was actually a dietitian colleague who had a client come in to a weight management program that she leads, that this person was just insistent that they were going to do keto and that this was going to be their approach to weight loss. So we all know where the conflict in this is, right? From a professional code of ethics standpoint, that there isn't data, really good data, on the effectiveness of the keto diet for long-term weight loss. There's data that shows short-term weight loss for sure. We also know as health professionals, as dietitians, that many healthy foods are eliminated on the eating plan, like grains, fruits, beans, legumes. There are many really healthy foods that are eliminated on the eating plan. But you have this client who is adamant that this is what they're going to do. So how do you manage this within the code of ethics? So I think the first part about this, and this is about empathizing with that client and understanding what their goals are, what the emotions involved in that are, and to really identify what their ultimate goal is. I think that the approach is to say you will coach them through this, but emphasizing the healthy opportunities within this eating plan. So you're not necessarily going to say, I'm supporting this entire approach, but I will support you as an individual trying to accomplish this long-term healthy lifestyle goal. Maybe suggest a modified approach. You know, how do you say take some of the principles of keto but do it in a healthier way? And I think it's fair to then share the concerns. So why are you concerned about this particular approach? And I think to provide support in the long term. We all know that this particular individual might try this approach even with modifications that you suggest. And 8 months down the road, they might be coming back to you saying this isn't working or whatever. And then there's your window to say, I'd like to kind of shift. I'd like to take a turn on this, and how do we approach this collectively in a way that I think might work. So I think it's a fine line between knowing that there isn't science on this, but how do you really put that client first in your mind and put the best interest of your client top of mind and say, how do you help move them, but using your knowledge and your expertise to do it in a modified way or in a healthier way, and know that you're talking to them for the long term, not the short term. But this is a really challenging one, I think, to be honest. I would say in all of these, there is a challenge in perfecting this balance. And I do think that for any dietitian today, there is challenge in this. The environment has changed significantly in how people are looking at food, how they're making decisions, and that doesn't make it easier for any of us by any means. So I think it's really about how do we work on that balance between trends, science, and our code of ethics. So I just wanted to kind of close with a couple of things around fact resistance and around how do you really manage this with the consumer today. I do think there's this opportunity to find common ground with any client or patient. Leah McGrath, who's our retail dietitian at Ingles Market, which is out east, told me one time the story that in the height of the high fructose corn syrup kind of issue and people believing that there were detrimental effects of high fructose corn syrup, she had a client come in one day and say, I need to know where you sell the Mexican sodas in your store because I can't have high fructose corn syrup. And there is a point, like Leah said, you just walk that person to that section because that person came in with an agenda, right? And you weren't going to sway that individual at all. And sometimes you just have to know that, right? And that's okay to let that go. So I think it's about knowing that, and then with those clients where you can find common ground, build that trust first, though, and even Leah would say that with that particular shopper who came in, there might be an opportunity in the future because obviously their health habits didn't change by using the product that was sweetened with cane sugar versus high fructose corn syrup. Their life, their health outcomes didn't change. There might be an opportunity in the future when that person comes back in to have a different dialogue. So I think to find ways to connect, to build trust, to really find common ground, and to first be human. I think we as dietitians tend to be very fact-focused. We tend to be, I often think, I would love to see a study on this, but I think because we're scientists that many dietitians probably have a high J, which is judgmental in Myers-Briggs, because you're judgmental about science, right? Like, you want to look at the detail of the science and those kinds of things, but I think we tend to lead with science and we tend to lead with facts instead of saying, how do I build rapport with this person? How do I understand what is that real question they're asking? Is it control, because I'm a new parent? Is it, safe food and wanting to take care of my family, and my family comes first, and worrying about the safety of their food? Really try and think about in their question, what's that emotion first, and addressing that first before giving them facts or feeding that information. And that's the point here about leading with emotion. And I think following up with science, even in writing, whether it's blogs or in Facebook Live segments or videos now, as we're seeing video just escalate so quickly as a preferred medium for consumers to gather information, I think there are opportunities first to lead with emotion and to really be that human first and find analogies and ways to communicate effectively. I think we have to understand that most individuals they're looking for ideas, comments, information that supports their preconceived notion. And so you have to find a way to kind of bring them along with you to the brighter side, and to the knowledgeable side. And that takes time and that takes relationship building. So just kind of a wrap up on the ethics point to make sure you really feel like you can claim that one CEU of that ethics for this session. I think always lead with honesty and integrity. I think find those professional boundaries, right? Understand that as a dietitian what our ethics are and what we're bound to. Interpret science without personal bias. Conflict of interest we didn't talk about today, but I think that's one that people are fairly familiar with. I do think this piece that as a health professional, whether you're communicating in social media and traditional media, whether you're talking one-on-one with a client, whether you're developing some sort of content, you always have that health hat on and that professional ethics hat on, and it's important to remember that it doesn't really just go away. And then just that whole piece around truthful and not misleading is at the core and the foundation of everything we do from a science-based perspective. So, and this is just that reminder, and I think what we talk about in the Code of Ethics, that evidence is really what sets dietitians apart in this space. There are a lot of Gwyneth Paltrow's out there, right, that are selling a story, and I think we have to find a way within our Code of Ethics and being evidence-based to elevate our voices collectively, but to do it because and I'll go back to Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. Like, I find it amusing that, those were trending so high, they were all the cheddar, and all of a sudden people are like, oh, they're highly processed. Really? Like, you didn't read the ingredient deck? My point being that it comes around, right? That the truth will eventually come around, and if you're a dietitian who held firm and that you were communicating that from the get-go, then you have your professional ethics intact and you have your professional standards intact, and I think that's what's important. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I use it a lot because I think this is perhaps the greatest challenge for all of us as dietitians, is to think like a wise man, to communicate in the language of the people. And so in my example about organic milk, we have the responsibility as dietitians to read the full research study. We don't get to just read the abstract, right? That's thinking like a wise person. It's doing the in-depth research that we need to. On the Dirty Dozen, it's really understanding how the environmental working group got to that list, understanding where the data comes from, and understanding USDA's data, right? So it's digging deep. But then when you communicate it, you can find ways that matter to the consumer and that resonate with the consumer in how you tell that story. Because you've done the deep dive, you've done the diligence, and you can find a way to communicate that in a way that resonates with your client or your patient or your shopper or consumer. So with that, I think we have time. We're good? I will take questions, comments. You can have comments too, or anecdotes. I'm open. Anyone? Yes.
I was wondering if you've given this presentation or presentations like this to individuals in California and how their response is.
I have done some things at the California Academy. The funny thing, when I talk about the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15, I legitimately had a dietitian ask me then, what organic products do I buy? Which I thought was funny, because I was like, wait, I think you missed the whole point of my story. I think that part of the challenge, right, is many of you, so today, right, I think 2% of consumers have a touch point with agriculture, so to speak. In Iowa, your percentage is much higher. I think in California, their percentage is much higher as well, but they have such access because of their weather. And so I remember one time I was doing a presentation at the Culinary Institute of America, and I was in line for the women's restroom, and there was a physician, it was a physician's conference, and there was a physician standing in front of me, and she said, I had a speaker ribbon like I do here, and she said, what are you speaking on? And I said, well, how registered dietitians in the grocery store can partner with healthcare entities. And she's like, what's a grocery store? What do you mean by a grocery store? And I was like, where do you buy your food? And she said that she buys all of her produce and everything at farmers markets, and she buys meat at Costco. And that was her grocery experience. But I think if you live in California, right, you have farmers markets year round. You have local almond growers and walnut growers, and you have so much there that just their food environment is so different than other parts of the country. But here you have it in the Midwest, and I live in Minnesota, we have growers, right? We have people who are growing row crops and all of those kinds of soybeans and corn and all those things. So I think it varies by parts of the country. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What are your favorite resources for finding evidence, for looking at studies, and are there certain databases or websites?
Yeah, and that's, so, and I'm going to say this loosely, I would say the mothership of the Academy, the evidence-based library is, I always check there. I would say that they are not current. And I think one of the challenges within the Academy structure, this is a challenge in a lot of fronts. So a lot of agriculture methodology kinds of things and topics around agriculture are not in scientific studies. And the Academy is very strict about the type of study they will look at. I was at a meeting last week with the Academy, and I'm on a task force within the foundation, and they were asking all these questions about retailers and the type of data that retailers have. Retailers have all kinds of data on their shoppers, right? They can tell you almost anything. I'll use the example too that Google just bought Fitbit. And so do you know what kind of power Google is going to have with knowing every one of us who wears one of these on our wrist, what kind of health, activities we're doing? Well, that's not ever going to get published. right? That's proprietary data that you're gonna pay for, but it's data that's really powerful. Like this, and matched with every Google search that every consumer in the country does, that's super powerful. So you have to understand, I think, that there's that hardcore scientific data, but then there's some of this other data as well. And I think as a dietitian, you have to put your hat on and say, how do I look at this and evaluate how the research was done, or how it was looked at? So like NPD or IRI's data that looks at all consumer grocery store sales, and so that's really powerful too, but you have to understand what it is. And so in my work, I look at a lot of different data sets, not just, you know, PubMed data, but I think you always have to evaluate how the research was done and what it's really telling you. And I think communicating it, again, I work in retail, so you're getting retail, in the retail industry, so you're getting retail examples, but the Food Marketing Institute is a trade organization for retailers, and they publish a study about the number of retailers that have grocery stores, and they will, that have the number of grocery stores that have dietitians, and they say that 90% of grocery stores have dietitians. That is not true. 90% of the people who responded to their survey have dietitians in their grocery store. Those are two very different things. And so then I think it's about communication too. I gave you a longer answer than you want, but other questions or comments? Yes?
Can you speak to, just having been cost delegates, we've kind of gone on this processed food and just what comes up to keep in mind. So your example, you immediately went to minimally processed maybe bread. Other people go immediately to Cheetos. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's a big tent.
It is.
And there are more reputable scientists coming out with concerns about highly processed food and having that be a big part of any community's diet. So what are some of your concerns around that, if any?
Well, and I'm not going to disagree with Cheetos. I mean, Cheetos have a place in the diet, but not a breakfast, lunch, dinner kind of place in the diet. And so I think it's more about, but I don't know that question about Cheetos is because it's highly processed or because of the lack of nutrient density, right? And so those are two different things in my mind. So I think I would say the same thing about Oreos. You know, it's lack of nutrient density. And so I think that's, from a health outcome standpoint, it isn't the fact that that's a processed food, it's the fact that it's a low nutrient density food. High caloric density, low nutrient density food, for me. And that's where I would go on that. Does other people have comments on that though? I would invite other thoughts. Anyone? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
What advice would you have for like a supermarket dietitian who has to highly promote a product she doesn't believe in, like $60 canisters of whey protein powder?
And I'll give you I mean, and this gets tricky, right? Because what I would say to that is to say, how do you pair that with other good, solid nutrition choices to make a combined approach to a healthier product, a healthier meal or snack, is what I would say is the opportunity there. Does that make sense? How do you pair fruits and vegetables with it? How do you, there's an interesting corollary story that H-E-B, which is a grocery store out of Texas, they know that the most highly purchased chicken is chicken thighs, right? So you could say as a dietitian, I'm going to try and move that consumer to skinless, boneless chicken breasts, or you could say, I'm going to build really healthy recipes using chicken thighs, right? You will have more success building really healthy recipes using chicken thighs because the consumer loves chicken thighs at H-E-B in Texas. So how do you build around that and make sure that the meal or the recipe is healthy or healthier, nutrient dense, whatever we're doing is. Yes. Sorry.
I work for a state university, and I get a lot of questions whenever I do campus events related to like our local food program. related to a lot of students who don't understand the difference between conventional, organic, different agricultural methods. And whenever I explain to them a little bit more, their response always is, well, you work for the state, you have to say that.
Oh, wow.
And I personally grew up on a family farm in the state of Iowa. I understand a lot of these things, but then it gets to be a little bit more emotional for me.
Yeah.
And so I just encourage them to meet with me later on and actually schedule an appointment. And then they swear at me and then walk off.
Yeah.
Is there a better way to approach that when I more education in the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Suggestions without crossing that line.
So just a clarifying question, because I am a Minnesota Gophers fan, are you a Hawkeye or a Cyclone?
I'm a Cyclone.
Okay, then we're good. There is a big Hawkeye Gopher game this weekend. I think the opportunity in that is to say, you know, that I think it's about saying that I go to work every day and I want to do a good job at work, but I have professional standards and personal standards that I wouldn't take a job that forced me to give a company line, so to speak. And I think that, you know, that you take pride in the work you do, that you evaluate it, that you know, I think that's like being emotional about what you do, but I also think it makes you human and puts them in this position of forcing to think about, oh, like, when I go to work or when I go to school, I want teachers to look at me or I want my boss to look at me in the same way, that I care about my job and that, but I have professional and ethical standards. You know, I think turn it that way, you know, that you don't have a company line, so to speak. Yeah. Good. And I'm sure you're cheering for the Gophers on Saturday. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys so much. This has been great to be here.